The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his Royal Guard uniform for what he believed would be another routine day. At 28 years old, Thomas had served the crown for nearly a decade, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him. His family had protected British royalty for generations, each man sworn to secrecy and absolute loyalty. Little did Thomas know that this particular Tuesday in March 2019 would forever change his understanding of the monarchy he served. Thomas had always been drawn to the castle's hidden corners and forgotten passages. During his off-duty hours, he would often explore areas that most guards ignored, fascinated by the centuries of history embedded in every stone. His curiosity was both a blessing and what his superiors sometimes called a minor fault. While other guards focused solely on their assigned duties, Thomas possessed an insatiable hunger to understand every inch of the fortress he protected. The renovation project in the East Wing had been ongoing for months. Ancient plumbing needed updating, and several rooms required structural repairs that hadn't been addressed since the Victorian era. Thomas had volunteered for the additional security detail overseeing the construction workers, partly because of the overtime pay, but mostly because he enjoyed watching the castle reveal its secrets as walls were opened and foundations examined. On this particular morning, the lead contractor, James Harrison, appeared more excited than usual. Harrison was a seasoned professional who had worked on historical buildings throughout England, but his usual calm demeanor was replaced with barely contained enthusiasm. He approached Thomas with a mixture of professional restraint and obvious anticipation. "Guard Mitchell," Harrison said, wiping dust from his hands, "we've encountered something rather unusual behind the wall in room 247. Nothing dangerous, mind you, but something that wasn't on any of our architectural plans. We need official approval before proceeding further." Thomas followed Harrison through the maze of scaffolding and plastic sheeting that had transformed the East Wing into a construction zone. Room 247 had been used for storage for decades, filled with furniture covered in white sheets and boxes of items that seemed to have been forgotten by time itself. Now, with most of the contents removed, the room felt cavernous and somehow expectant. The contractor led Thomas to the far wall, where a section of Victorian wallpaper had been carefully peeled away to reveal older stonework beneath.
What caught Thomas's attention immediately was the irregularity in the stone pattern.
While most of the wall showed the consistent craftsmanship typical of medieval construction, one section displayed stones that were clearly from a different period and had been fitted with unusual precision. "Look here," Harrison explained, running his weathered hand along the stone joints. "These stones were added much later than the original wall construction. See how the mortar is different? And notice this slight depression in the pattern. We believe there might be a space behind this section." Thomas examined the wall more closely. His years of studying the castle's architecture told him that Harrison was absolutely correct. The stonework was masterful, but it was clearly meant to conceal rather than simply construct. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to hide whatever lay beyond this wall, and they had done so with the skill of someone who understood that the secret needed to remain hidden for a very long time. "Have you informed the head of security?" Thomas asked, though he already suspected the answer. Harrison was too experienced to have called only a junior guard if standard protocol had been followed. "That's just it." Harrison replied with a slight frown. "Mr. Pemberton is attending meetings in London all week. The deputy head said to proceed with caution and document everything, but he's dealing with the incident in the South Wing. You're the only guard available who has clearance for this area and knowledge of historical protocols." Thomas understood the delicate position he was in. Discovery of any previously unknown space within the castle required careful handling. Such spaces could contain anything from forgotten storage areas to historically significant artifacts. More importantly, they could potentially house items that the royal family preferred to keep private. His training had emphasized that discretion was just as important as security when dealing with unexpected discoveries. "What do you recommend for safely investigating further?" Thomas asked, knowing that Harrison's experience with historical buildings made him the expert in this situation. Harrison pulled out a small device that Thomas recognized as a ground-penetrating radar unit. "We can use this to determine if there's actually a void behind the wall and get some idea of its size. If there is a space, we can make a small inspection hole to assess the situation before deciding how to proceed." Thomas nodded his approval, understanding that this approach balanced curiosity with caution. He watched as Harrison calibrated the device and began slowly scanning the suspicious section of wall. The radar unit emitted soft beeping sounds as it detected variations in density behind the stones. The results were immediate and unmistakable. The device clearly showed a hollow space approximately 8 feet wide and extending back at least 6 feet. More intriguingly, the radar suggested that the space contained objects of varying density, indicating that this was not simply an architectural void but a deliberately created chamber that housed something. "There's definitely a room back there," Harrison confirmed, studying the device's display, "and it's not empty. Whatever is in there has been placed deliberately." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. In his years of service, he had heard stories from older guards about hidden chambers and secret spaces throughout the castle. Most guards dismissed these stories as legends or exaggerations, but Thomas had always suspected that a fortress with nearly 1,000 years of history would naturally accumulate secrets. Now he was potentially facing one of those secrets directly. "Can you make an inspection hole without damaging whatever might be inside?" Thomas asked, his training warring with his curiosity. Harrison nodded confidently. "I can remove a few stones from this section here." He pointed to an area near the bottom of the suspicious wall section. "It's clearly been designed to be removable, though it's been sealed for a very long time. The mortar is old but not original to the wall construction." As Harrison began carefully working on the stones, Thomas found himself thinking about the generations of guards who had walked these halls before him. How many of them had noticed irregularities like this, but simply followed orders to ignore anything that wasn't their direct responsibility? How many secrets had been preserved simply because people chose not to look too closely at things that seemed unusual? The first stone came free with surprising ease, followed quickly by 2 others. Harrison used a small flashlight to peer into the opening, and his sharp intake of breath told Thomas that whatever lay beyond was significant. "Guard Mitchell," Harrison said quietly, "I think you need to see this." Thomas knelt beside the opening and accepted the flashlight. The beam cut through darkness that had remained undisturbed for decades, possibly longer. What he saw made him understand immediately why this chamber had been so carefully concealed. The space beyond was indeed a room, but unlike any room Thomas had seen in the castle. The walls were lined with what appeared to be custom-built wooden shelving, and those shelves held dozens of boxes, cases, and containers of various sizes. More striking was the evidence of careful organization and preservation. This was not a storage area that had been hastily filled and forgotten. Someone had taken great care to arrange and protect whatever was housed in this hidden chamber. But what truly captured Thomas's attention was a large frame leaning against the far wall. Even in the limited light, he could see that it contained what appeared to be an official document of some kind, elaborately decorated, and bearing what looked like royal seals. Next to it stood several smaller frames and what appeared to be a wooden chest with metal clasps. "This isn't just a storage room," Thomas whispered, more to himself than to Harrison. "This is an archive." Harrison leaned closer to the opening. An archive of what? Thomas played the flashlight beam across more of the chamber's contents. Everywhere the light touched revealed evidence of careful preservation and organization. Someone had created this space to protect specific items from discovery, but also from deterioration. The person or people responsible had intended for these items to survive indefinitely. "I need to contact my superiors immediately," Thomas said, though he realized that with the deputy head busy and the head of security in London, he was essentially the senior authority on site. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders. Harrison began replacing the stones they had removed. "Should we seal this back up until you receive instructions?" Thomas considered the question carefully. Protocol suggested that they should secure the area and wait for higher authority to make decisions. But his instincts told him that this discovery was too significant to simply ignore until convenient. More troubling was the growing suspicion that this chamber had been deliberately placed beyond the reach of standard castle security protocols. "Secure it for now," Thomas decided, "but don't make it permanent. I have a feeling we'll be back very soon." As Harrison worked to temporarily seal the opening, Thomas found himself studying the room around them with new eyes. Room 247 had always seemed like an ordinary storage space, forgotten and unimportant. Now he realized that its very ordinariness might have been carefully cultivated. Someone had wanted this room to appear boring and forgettable, specifically to protect the secret it contained. The implications were staggering. A hidden archive in Windsor Castle could contain any number of sensitive materials. Historical documents that had been thought lost, personal papers of former monarchs, diplomatic correspondence that could still carry political significance, or family secrets that the royal household preferred to keep private. Thomas realized that his routine day had evolved into something that could potentially affect not just his career, but his entire life. Secrets of this magnitude were not discovered lightly, and those who discovered them often found their lives fundamentally changed by the knowledge they gained. As the contractors finished their work and began cleaning up, Thomas remained in the room, staring at the wall that now appeared completely innocent. Behind those carefully fitted stones lay answers to questions he hadn't even known to ask. More importantly, those answers belonged to the royal family he had sworn to protect, and he was now responsible for ensuring that whatever secrets lay hidden would be handled with appropriate discretion and loyalty. The afternoon sun slanted through the room's windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Thomas understood that he stood at a crossroads that would define the rest of his service to the crown. The oath he had taken years earlier had seemed straightforward at the time: protect the royal family and maintain absolute discretion about their private affairs. Now that oath was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. His phone buzzed with a message from his supervisor, asking for an update on the renovation progress. Thomas stared at the device, knowing that his response would set in motion events that could not be undone. Once he reported the discovery, it would become part of official castle security records. Other people would become involved, decisions would be made by higher authorities, and the secret chamber would no longer be his alone to protect. But Thomas also understood that his loyalty to the crown meant more than simply following orders. It meant making decisions that served the best interests of the royal family, even when those decisions were difficult or personally challenging. The hidden chamber represented a trust that had been carefully maintained by someone in the past, and now that trust was passing to him. He typed a careful response to his supervisor. Renovation proceeding normally. Minor structural issue discovered that may require special handling. Will provide detailed report upon your return. It was truthful without being specific, buying him time to better understand what he had discovered before involving others. Thomas knew that this decision carried risks, but it also demonstrated the kind of judgment that his family had exercised in service to the crown for generations. As the construction workers began leaving for the day, Thomas remained in room 247, ostensibly completing paperwork, but actually contemplating the magnitude of his discovery. The chamber behind the wall contained secrets that someone had deemed important enough to preserve and hide. Now those secrets were his responsibility, and how he handled them would determine whether he proved worthy of the trust that had been passed down through generations of royal guards. The castle around him seemed different now, no longer just a beautiful historical building, but a repository of layers upon layers of carefully guarded secrets. Thomas understood that he had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. Tomorrow he would need to find a way to properly investigate the chamber's contents while maintaining the discretion and loyalty that his oath demanded. Night was falling over Windsor Castle, and Thomas Mitchell, royal guard and keeper of secrets, prepared to discover just how deep those secrets ran. Thomas Mitchell barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the beam of his flashlight cutting through decades of darkness in the hidden chamber. By 4 a.m, he had given up on rest entirely and instead sat at his small kitchen table drinking coffee and trying to understand the implications of what he had discovered. The practical concerns weighed heavily on his mind. As a royal guard, he had been trained to handle sensitive situations with discretion, but nothing in his training had prepared him for discovering what appeared to be a deliberate archive hidden within the castle walls. The protocols for handling unexpected discoveries assumed that such findings would be routine: forgotten furniture, outdated equipment, or at most, items of minor historical interest. This felt entirely different. The care with which the chamber had been constructed and concealed suggested that its contents were far from routine. Someone with significant resources and intimate knowledge of the castle's construction had gone to extraordinary lengths to create a secure hiding place. More troubling was the realization that this someone had possessed the authority to undertake such work without leaving traces in the official architectural records. Thomas understood enough about castle security to know that any major construction or modification required multiple approvals and extensive documentation. The absence of any record of this chamber suggested either that it predated modern security protocols or that it had been created with deliberate circumvention of those protocols. Neither possibility was comforting. By dawn, Thomas had made his decision. He would return to the chamber alone before the construction workers arrived and conduct a more thorough investigation of its contents. This decision violated several security protocols, but Thomas reasoned that his oath to protect the royal family extended to protecting them from potentially embarrassing revelations made by civilian contractors. The castle was quiet in the early morning hours, with only essential security staff on duty. Thomas used his access codes to enter the East Wing and made his way to room 247. The construction area looked different in the dim emergency lighting, more mysterious and somehow expectant. Working quickly and quietly, Thomas removed the stones that Harrison had temporarily replaced. The opening seemed larger in the darkness, and his flashlight beam felt inadequate to illuminate the chamber beyond. He had brought a portable LED lantern, which cast a much broader light when he set it inside the hidden room. What he saw exceeded his expectations and deepened his concerns. The chamber was approximately 8 feet wide, 6 feet deep, and 7 feet tall, large enough to be a proper room rather than simply a hiding place. The wooden shelving that lined the walls was of exceptional quality, clearly custom-built for this specific space. Every surface showed evidence of careful construction and long-term planning. Thomas counted more than 30 containers of various sizes arranged on the shelves. Some were modern archival boxes, suggesting that items had been added to the chamber relatively recently. Others were older wooden boxes with brass fittings that appeared to be from an earlier era. Several leather portfolios lay flat on one shelf, their surfaces showing the kind of wear that indicated frequent handling over many years. But it was the large framed document leaning against the far wall that commanded Thomas's attention. Moving carefully into the chamber, he was able to examine it more closely. The frame itself was of museum quality, designed to protect and preserve its contents. Behind the glass was what appeared to be an official royal document, ornately decorated with hand-painted illumination and bearing multiple wax seals. Thomas could make out portions of the text written in formal English that appeared to be from the mid-20th century. Several phrases caught his attention. By royal warrant, in consideration of faithful service, and to be held in perpetual trust. Most significantly, he could clearly see the signature at the bottom of the document, Elizabeth R., followed by a date in 1953. The document appeared to be some form of royal warrant or official appointment, but unlike any Thomas had seen in his years of service. Standard royal warrants were matters of public record, proudly displayed by those who received them. This document had been carefully hidden, suggesting that it granted authority or recognition that was meant to remain private. Thomas photographed the document with his phone, being careful to capture both the overall appearance and specific details of the text and seals. He understood that proper analysis would require expert examination, but he wanted to ensure he had a record of what he had found. Moving to the shelves, Thomas began examining the other containers. One of the archival boxes was labeled in neat handwriting, Personal Correspondence, Confidential, 1952-1960. Another bore the label Family Photographs, Private Collection. A leather portfolio was marked simply Documents Restricted Access. Thomas realized that he was looking at what appeared to be a personal archive of Queen Elizabeth II, containing materials that had been deliberately kept separate from official royal records. The dates on several containers suggested that items had been placed in this chamber throughout the Queen's reign, with some additions as recent as the early 2000s. The implications were staggering. This was not simply a forgotten storage area, but an active archive that had been maintained over decades. Someone with intimate access to the Queen's personal affairs had been regularly adding materials to this collection, preserving items that were considered too sensitive for standard royal archives. Thomas opened one of the smaller boxes, revealing a collection of handwritten letters tied with a ribbon. The paper was of exceptional quality, and several letters bore letterheads from various government ministries and foreign embassies. Without reading the contents, Thomas could see that these were communications of a highly personal and potentially sensitive nature. Another box contained what appeared to be photographs, many in professional folders, that suggested they had been taken by official royal photographers. Thomas examined a few of the folders and found images that he had never seen in any public collection. Some showed the Queen in informal settings with people Thomas didn't recognize. Others captured moments that seemed too private for public consumption, yet had been carefully preserved rather than destroyed. The wooden chest that Thomas had noticed during his initial exploration proved to be locked, but the craftsmanship suggested it contained items of particular importance. The metal fittings were tarnished with age, but the wood remained in excellent condition, indicating that the chamber's environment had been carefully controlled to prevent deterioration. Thomas spent nearly 2 hours cataloging and photographing the chamber's contents, being careful not to disturb the organization that had clearly been maintained over many years. The scope of the collection suggested that multiple people had been involved in its creation and maintenance, yet the secret had been kept perfectly. As he prepared to leave the chamber, Thomas noticed something he had initially overlooked. On the inside of the chamber door, which was actually a section of the wall that had been designed to swing inward, was a handwritten note attached with a small metal clip. The note was written on personal stationery bearing the cipher of Queen Elizabeth II. In the Queen's distinctive handwriting were the words, "For the protection of family honor and the preservation of private truths that history may someday require. To be opened only by one whose loyalty is absolute and whose discretion is unquestioned. E.R. 1977. Thomas stared at the note, understanding that he had stumbled upon something far more significant than a simple hidden storage area. This was a deliberate legacy created by Queen Elizabeth herself as a repository for sensitive materials that she had deemed too important to destroy but too private to include in official archives. The date of 1977 was significant. It marked the year of the Queen's Silver Jubilee, a time when she might have been reflecting on her reign and considering how to preserve certain aspects of her experiences for posterity. The note suggested that the Queen had personally overseen the creation of this archive and had given careful thought to who might eventually discover it. Thomas realized that Queen Elizabeth's reference to one whose loyalty is absolute and whose discretion is unquestioned might not have been accidental. The chamber had been placed in an area of the castle that was regularly patrolled by guards but rarely visited by senior officials. Its discovery by a loyal guard, rather than by construction workers or maintenance staff, might have been part of the Queen's plan. The weight of responsibility settled more heavily on Thomas's shoulders. He was not simply the accidental discoverer of royal secrets, but potentially the person Queen Elizabeth had envisioned would eventually take custody of these materials. The trust implicit in that realization was both humbling and terrifying. Thomas carefully replaced all items exactly as he had found them and sealed the chamber securely. As he made his way back through the castle in the growing daylight, he understood that his life had fundamentally changed. He now possessed knowledge that connected him directly to Queen Elizabeth's most private thoughts and decisions. The construction workers would be arriving soon, and Thomas needed to make a decision about how to proceed. He could report his discovery through official channels, which would remove the burden of secrecy from his shoulders, but would also mean that the Queen's carefully guarded privacy would be examined by people who might not share her intentions for these materials. Alternatively, he could find a way to take personal custody of the archive, becoming its guardian in the manner that the Queen seemed to have intended. This choice would require him to violate several security protocols and would place him in a position of enormous responsibility and potential risk. Thomas understood that either choice would define the rest of his life. The easy path was to follow official procedures and let higher authorities make the difficult decisions. The harder path was to honor what appeared to be Queen Elizabeth's trust by taking personal responsibility for protecting her legacy. As he settled back into his normal duties for the day, Thomas found himself studying the faces of his fellow guards and the senior staff who moved through the castle. How many of them had knowledge of secrets like this? How many had faced similar decisions about loyalty and discretion? How many had chosen the harder path of personal responsibility over the easier path of official procedures? The day passed slowly, with Thomas maintaining his normal routine while his thoughts remained focused on the hidden chamber and its contents. Every interaction with his superiors felt weighted with unspoken implications. Every security briefing seemed to contain potential relevance to his discovery. By evening, Thomas had reached a conclusion that surprised him with its clarity. He would take personal custody of Queen Elizabeth's private archive, not because he sought the burden of such responsibility, but because he understood that the Queen had trusted future generations of loyal servants to protect what she could not entrust to official channels. The decision meant that Thomas would become more than just a royal guard. He would become a keeper of royal secrets, bound by oaths that went far beyond his official duties. It was a role that his father and grandfather might have understood, rooted in the kind of personal loyalty that had sustained the monarchy through centuries of challenge and change. Thomas spent his final evening before fully committing to this path walking through the castle, seeing it with new eyes as a place where countless individuals had made similar decisions about loyalty, duty, and the protection of royal privacy. He was joining a tradition that was older and deeper than any official protocol, becoming part of the living legacy of service to the crown. Tomorrow, he would begin the delicate process of securing Queen Elizabeth's hidden archive while maintaining his cover as a simple guard doing his duty. The challenge would be enormous, but Thomas understood that some responsibilities were worth accepting regardless of their difficulty. Queen Elizabeth had trusted that such a person would eventually find her secret legacy, and Thomas was determined to prove himself worthy of that trust. Thomas Mitchell stood before the sealed chamber at 3 a.m, knowing that what he was about to do would irrevocably change his relationship with the crown he had sworn to serve. In his hands, he held a detailed plan he had spent 2 weeks developing, a method to safely remove Queen Elizabeth's private archive from its hiding place and relocate it to a secure location where he could properly examine and protect its contents. The past fortnight had been the most challenging of Thomas's career. He had maintained his regular duties while secretly researching property records, studying castle security protocols, and carefully observing the patterns of staff and security rotations. Every conversation with his superiors felt like a test of his ability to conceal his true thoughts, and every routine security briefing seemed to carry potential relevance to his secret knowledge. Thomas had also spent considerable time researching Queen Elizabeth's personal history, particularly focusing on the period around 1977, when she had apparently established the hidden archive. What he discovered painted a picture of a monarch who had faced unprecedented challenges to royal privacy and who had shown remarkable foresight in protecting sensitive materials from future scrutiny. The 1970s had been a particularly difficult decade for the royal family. Public interest in royal private lives had intensified dramatically, fueled by increasingly aggressive media coverage and changing social attitudes toward traditional institutions. During this period, Queen Elizabeth had navigated multiple family crises while maintaining her public duties, often finding herself protecting information that could damage both individual family members and the institution of monarchy itself. Thomas's research suggested that the Queen's decision to create a private archive in 1977 had been motivated by her recognition that certain aspects of royal life required protection that official channels could not provide. The Silver Jubilee year had marked not only a celebration of her reign, but also a moment of reflection on the challenges she had faced and those she anticipated in the future. Understanding this context had solidified Thomas's conviction that he was meant to discover and protect this archive. Queen Elizabeth had demonstrated extraordinary wisdom in recognizing that future threats to royal privacy would require protection measures that existed outside official protocols. Her trust in the loyalty and discretion of individual servants represented a return to older traditions of personal service that had sustained the monarchy through previous challenges. Thomas had also made a crucial discovery during his research. His own family's connection to royal service ran deeper than he had previously understood. His great-grandfather had served Queen Victoria, and family records suggested that he had been involved in protecting sensitive royal materials during the turbulent period surrounding World War I. This legacy of trusted service provided additional confirmation that Thomas's role as guardian of Queen Elizabeth's archive was not accidental but part of a continuing tradition. The practical challenges of relocating the archive had required careful planning. Thomas had identified a secure location, a small cottage he had inherited from his grandmother, located in a rural area 40 miles from Windsor. The cottage was isolated, structurally sound, and unknown to anyone in his current life. More importantly, it had a basement that could be modified to provide proper environmental controls for document preservation. Over the past 2 weeks, Thomas had used his days off to prepare the cottage, installing humidity control systems, security devices, and proper storage facilities. He had also established a complex system of alibis and cover stories that would allow him to visit the cottage regularly without arousing suspicion from his colleagues or superiors. Now, standing before the hidden chamber, Thomas felt the weight of Queen Elizabeth's trust settling upon his shoulders. The note she had left suggested that she had anticipated this moment, when a loyal servant would take custody of her most private legacy. Thomas understood that accepting this responsibility meant binding himself to the Queen's memory and intentions in ways that went far beyond his official oath of service. Working with practiced efficiency, Thomas began the delicate process of removing items from the archive. Each container was carefully wrapped and labeled before being placed in specially designed transportation cases that would protect their contents during the journey to the cottage. The process took nearly 4 hours, during which Thomas maintained constant awareness of security patrols and potential interruptions. The large framed document that had first captured his attention proved to be the most challenging item to transport safely. Thomas had prepared a custom carrying case that would protect the frame while allowing for discreet movement through the castle. As he carefully lifted the document, he took a moment to examine the royal warrant more closely in the improved lighting he had brought. The document was indeed signed by Queen Elizabeth, and the date was clearly marked as June 2, 1953, just days after her coronation. The text, written in formal legal language, appeared to grant special authority to someone identified only as the appointed guardian of private royal trust. Thomas realized that he was looking at a document that might have established the very role he was now assuming. The implications were staggering. Queen Elizabeth had apparently created a formal legal framework for the protection of sensitive royal materials, establishing authority that existed outside normal governmental and institutional channels. This document suggested that she had been planning for the eventual need to entrust private materials to individual servants whose loyalty transcended official protocols. Thomas carefully photographed every page of the document before packing it for transport. The legal language was complex, but several phrases stood out clearly. In recognition of circumstances that may require discretion beyond official channels, to preserve family honor against future challenges, and to be activated only when necessity demands absolute trust. By dawn, Thomas had successfully relocated the entire contents of Queen Elizabeth's hidden archive to his cottage. The chamber in Windsor Castle had been carefully cleaned and resealed, leaving no evidence of its recent activity. The construction workers would continue their renovation project, unaware that they had been working mere feet away from one of the most sensitive royal secrets. Thomas spent the morning organizing the archive in its new location, taking careful inventory of every item and beginning the process of proper examination and cataloging. The scope of the collection continued to astound him. In addition to the official documents and personal correspondence, he discovered items that provided intimate glimpses into Queen Elizabeth's private thoughts and concerns. One leather portfolio contained what appeared to be the Queen's personal reflections on various constitutional crises she had navigated during her reign. Another held copies of private correspondence with world leaders, including exchanges that had never been included in official diplomatic records. Several boxes contained family photographs and documents that revealed previously unknown aspects of royal family relationships. Perhaps most significantly, Thomas found a series of sealed envelopes, each marked with a specific date and bearing the instruction to be opened only if circumstances require. The dates ranged from 1977 to 2019, suggesting that Queen Elizabeth had continued adding to the archive throughout her reign, preparing for contingencies that she hoped would never arise but wanted to be prepared for nonetheless. Thomas realized that he was now custodian of what amounted to Queen Elizabeth's alternative historical record, her personal account of events and decisions that had shaped both her reign and her family. This was not simply a collection of sensitive documents, but a comprehensive legacy that provided the Queen's private perspective on the most significant events of the modern era. The responsibility was overwhelming. Thomas understood that he now possessed information that could potentially affect diplomatic relations, constitutional understanding, and public perception of the royal family. More importantly, he held Queen Elizabeth's trust that this information would be protected and used only in ways that served the best interests of the crown and the nation. As he continued cataloging the archive's contents, Thomas discovered additional evidence that his role had been carefully anticipated. Among the Queen's personal papers was a letter addressed to the Guardian of Private Trust, dated 1995. The letter provided detailed instructions for the protection and potential use of the archive's contents. including specific circumstances under which certain materials might be revealed and others that should remain permanently confidential. The letter also contained a personal message from Queen Elizabeth to whoever would eventually take custody of her private legacy. She wrote of her understanding that certain aspects of royal service required personal loyalty that transcended official duties, and her gratitude to those who would accept the burden of protecting royal privacy for future generations. Reading these words, Thomas felt a profound connection to the Queen's vision of service and duty. He understood that she had recognized the limitations of institutional protection for royal privacy, and had chosen to trust in the personal loyalty of individual servants. This trust represented both an honor and an enormous responsibility. Thomas spent the rest of the day developing systems for the ongoing protection and management of the archive. He established secure communication protocols, created detailed cataloging systems, and began planning for the long-term preservation of the materials. He also began the process of deeper research into the contents, understanding that proper guardianship required comprehensive knowledge of what he was protecting. By evening, Thomas had transformed from a loyal guard into something far more significant, a keeper of royal secrets whose role existed outside all official channels but was bound by oaths deeper than any formal protocol. He understood that this transformation was permanent and that his life would now be defined by his responsibility to Queen Elizabeth's trust. The cottage felt different now, no longer simply a quiet retreat, but a secure repository of some of the most sensitive information in British history. Thomas realized that he had become part of a tradition of service that was both ancient and vital, continuing a legacy of protection that had sustained the monarchy through centuries of challenge. As he prepared for sleep in his new role as guardian, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. What had begun as routine curiosity about castle architecture had evolved into acceptance of one of the most significant responsibilities any servant could assume. He had become not just a protector of royal persons, but a guardian of royal memory and privacy. The weight of Queen Elizabeth's trust settled around him like a mantle, both comforting and sobering. Thomas understood that he had been chosen not by accident but by the convergence of circumstances that the Queen had anticipated decades earlier. His loyalty, discretion, and family history of service had prepared him for this moment, and he was determined to prove worthy of the trust that had been placed in him. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of his true work as guardian of Queen Elizabeth's private legacy, a role that would require not only absolute secrecy but also the wisdom to understand when and how the trust he protected might best serve the crown and the nation. Thomas Mitchell, Royal Guard, had become something far greater, a living link between Queen Elizabeth's vision and the future protection of royal privacy. Thomas Mitchell had been serving as guardian of Queen Elizabeth's private archive for 6 months when he made a discovery that would test every aspect of his loyalty and judgment. Hidden within one of the sealed envelopes marked "to be opened only if circumstances require," he found documents that revealed a secret so profound it could potentially reshape understanding of modern British history. The envelope had been marked with the date 1982 inches and bore the additional notation, "Falklands, Private Truth." Thomas had initially hesitated to open it, understanding that Queen Elizabeth's instructions were meant to be followed precisely. However, recent political developments had created circumstances that seemed to align with the conditions the Queen had specified for accessing this particular information. The current political climate in Britain was turbulent, with renewed debates about the Falklands War's conduct and lasting implications. Several retired military officers had begun speaking publicly about previously classified aspects of the conflict, and there were growing calls for a comprehensive historical review of the government's decisions during that critical period. Thomas realized that the envelope's contents might contain information relevant to these contemporary debates. Inside the envelope, Thomas found a collection of documents that revealed Queen Elizabeth's private concerns about decisions made during the Falklands conflict. The materials included copies of private correspondence between the Queen and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, personal notes documenting the Queen's constitutional concerns about military planning, and records of conversations with military advisors that had never been included in official war records. Most significantly, Thomas discovered evidence that Queen Elizabeth had privately questioned certain aspects of the military campaign's conduct and had expressed concerns about decisions that she felt exceeded the government's constitutional authority. These concerns had been documented in her private papers but had never been shared through official channels, reflecting her understanding that such revelations could undermine both government authority and military morale during a national crisis. The documents painted a picture of a monarch who had been deeply engaged with the constitutional implications of wartime decision-making while carefully maintaining her public role of supporting the government's actions. Queen Elizabeth had apparently used her private archive to preserve her true thoughts and concerns for potential future reference, understanding that her public position required her to support decisions she privately questioned. Thomas realized that these documents could have enormous contemporary relevance. The ongoing political debates about the Falklands War had reached a point where Queen Elizabeth's private perspectives could provide crucial historical context. However, revealing such information would also expose the extent to which the Queen had privately disagreed with government decisions while publicly supporting them. The implications extended far beyond historical interest. If the documents became public, they could affect current political relationships, influence ongoing policy debates, and potentially embarrass both the royal family and former government officials who were still active in public life. Thomas understood that deciding how to handle this information would require wisdom that went far beyond his training as a royal guard. Over the following weeks, Thomas conducted extensive research into the historical context of the documents and their potential contemporary relevance. He studied the ongoing political debates, analyzed the positions of various parties, and attempted to understand how Queen Elizabeth might have intended for this information to be used. The complexity of the situation was compounded by Thomas's realization that he possessed other sealed envelopes containing potentially sensitive information about different periods and events. The Queen's private archive was not simply a historical collection, but a comprehensive record of her private thoughts on the most significant events of her reign. Each sealed envelope represented a potential revelation that could affect contemporary understanding of British history. Thomas found himself grappling with questions that had no clear answers. His oath as a royal guard required him to protect the royal family's interests, but which interests took precedence when they potentially conflicted? Should he prioritize protecting Queen Elizabeth's reputation by keeping her private doubts secret, or honor her apparent intention that this information might someday serve the greater good? The letter Queen Elizabeth had written to the Guardian of Private Trust provided some guidance, but its instructions were necessarily general and required interpretation in light of specific circumstances. She had written of her trust that the Guardian would use wisdom and discretion to serve the Crown's highest interests, but determining those interests in complex political situations required judgment that Thomas felt inadequately prepared to exercise. Thomas decided to seek guidance by examining other materials in the archive that might illuminate Queen Elizabeth's intentions. Among her personal papers, he found additional letters and notes that revealed her thinking about the relationship between royal privacy and public service. These documents showed a monarch who had given careful thought to the circumstances under which private royal information might appropriately be revealed. In a letter dated 1988, Queen Elizabeth had written about her belief that royal service sometimes requires accepting burdens of knowledge that cannot be shared, while recognizing that extraordinary circumstances might require extraordinary measures to serve the greater good. She had also noted her understanding that those entrusted with royal secrets must sometimes make decisions that monarchs themselves cannot make publicly. These writings suggested that Queen Elizabeth had anticipated situations where the guardian of her private archive might need to act independently, using their judgment to determine how best to serve royal interests even when such action might involve revealing information the Queen had kept private during her lifetime. Thomas spent considerable time studying the specific language Queen Elizabeth had used in her instructions for the Falklands envelope. The phrase, "to be opened only if circumstances require," was deliberately vague, but the context suggested that she had anticipated a situation where historical truth might serve important contemporary purposes. After weeks of deliberation, Thomas reached a decision that reflected both his loyalty to Queen Elizabeth's memory and his understanding of her broader intentions. He would prepare the Falklands documents for potential revelation, but he would do so in a manner that honored the Queen's concerns about the impact of such revelations on living individuals and ongoing political relationships. Thomas developed a plan to selectively share information from the archive with historians and political analysts, who could provide appropriate context and ensure that any revelation served historical understanding rather than contemporary political advantage. He would focus on aspects of the documents that illuminated constitutional principles and historical truth, while protecting personal reputations and sensitive political relationships. The process required Thomas to become more than just a guardian of secrets. He needed to become a careful interpreter of Queen Elizabeth's intentions and a wise judge of how her private thoughts could best serve the public good. This evolution in his role reflected the Queen's apparent understanding that protecting royal interests sometimes required active engagement with contemporary issues rather than simple preservation of historical materials. Thomas began reaching out to carefully selected historians and constitutional scholars, individuals whose integrity and discretion he had researched extensively. His approach was subtle and gradual, sharing general historical context before revealing the existence of more specific information. Each conversation was designed to gauge whether the recipient could handle sensitive information appropriately. The responses Thomas received confirmed his belief that Queen Elizabeth's private perspectives on significant historical events could provide valuable insights for contemporary understanding. Several historians expressed frustration with gaps in the official record of royal involvement in political decisions, noting that such information could illuminate important constitutional principles. However, Thomas also received warnings about the potential consequences of revealing royal private thoughts about government decisions. Several experts cautioned that such revelations could undermine the traditional understanding of royal neutrality and could complicate future relationships between monarchs and governments. These conversations helped Thomas refine his understanding of how to responsibly share information from Queen Elizabeth's archive. He developed criteria for determining which materials could be revealed without causing inappropriate harm to individuals or institutions, while still serving the historical and constitutional purposes that the Queen appeared to have intended. The Falklands documents became a test case for Thomas's approach to his role as guardian. After months of careful consideration, he decided to share selected portions of the documents with a respected military historian who was conducting research on constitutional aspects of wartime decision-making. The historian's response confirmed that the information provided valuable historical context while raising important questions about the relationship between royal constitutional roles and government authority during national crises. Thomas's decision to share this information represented an evolution in his understanding of his role. He was not simply preserving Queen Elizabeth's secrets but actively interpreting her intentions and applying her wisdom to contemporary circumstances. This required him to become a scholar of constitutional history, a judge of political implications, and a careful steward of royal reputation. The experience taught Thomas that Queen Elizabeth's private archive was not meant to be a static collection, but a living resource that could serve the Crown's interests across changing circumstances. The Queen's foresight in creating such a comprehensive record suggested that she had understood the need for flexible approaches to protecting royal interests in an evolving political landscape. As Thomas continued his work as guardian, he developed increasingly sophisticated methods for analyzing the archive's contents and determining how different materials might appropriately be used. Each decision required balancing multiple considerations: historical accuracy, political implications, personal privacy, institutional protection, and the Queen's apparent intentions. The role had transformed Thomas from a loyal servant following orders into an independent agent exercising judgment on behalf of royal interests that extended far beyond simple protection of secrets. He had become a living extension of Queen Elizabeth's wisdom, tasked with applying her insights to circumstances she could not have specifically anticipated but had prepared for through her comprehensive documentation of private thoughts and concerns. Thomas understood that his work as guardian would continue evolving as political circumstances changed and as he gained deeper understanding of the archive's contents. Each sealed envelope represented another potential test of his judgment, another opportunity to serve the Crown's interests by applying Queen Elizabeth's private wisdom to contemporary challenges. The weight of this responsibility continued to grow, but so did Thomas's confidence in his ability to fulfill the trust that had been placed in him. Queen Elizabeth's careful preparation of her private archive had provided not only the materials, but also the guidance necessary for their appropriate use. Thomas was proving himself worthy of the role she had envisioned, becoming a guardian not just of royal secrets, but of royal wisdom itself. 2 years had passed since Thomas Mitchell first discovered Queen Elizabeth's hidden archive, and his role as guardian had evolved into something far more complex and significant than he had ever imagined. The cottage that housed the royal secrets had become both sanctuary and command center, where Thomas worked to balance the competing demands of historical preservation, contemporary relevance, and absolute discretion. The political landscape of Britain had continued to evolve, creating new challenges and opportunities for the careful application of Queen Elizabeth's private wisdom. Thomas had successfully managed several situations where information from the archive provided crucial historical context for contemporary debates, always ensuring that revelations served the Crown's interests while respecting the Queen's intentions for privacy and discretion. His most significant challenge came when he discovered the final sealed envelope in Queen Elizabeth's collection, marked simply "For the Future," and dated just months before her death. Inside, Thomas found a letter addressed directly to him, though it used only the formal title Guardian of Private Trust. The letter revealed that Queen Elizabeth had somehow anticipated that her private archive would eventually be discovered by someone with Thomas's specific background and circumstances. The letter was both deeply personal and profoundly official, reflecting Queen Elizabeth's unique ability to blend intimate understanding with formal authority. She wrote of her gratitude for the loyalty of servants like Thomas, whose families had served the Crown across generations, and her confidence that such service would continue protecting royal interests long after her own death. Most remarkably, the letter contained specific instructions for the future management of the archive, including provisions for its eventual transition to a new guardian and guidelines for determining when and how certain materials might be revealed to serve historical understanding. Queen Elizabeth had apparently spent considerable time developing a comprehensive framework for the archive's long-term stewardship. The letter also revealed information that fundamentally changed Thomas's understanding of his role. Queen Elizabeth disclosed that similar private archives existed in other royal residences, each maintained by carefully selected individuals whose loyalty and discretion had been tested over time. Thomas learned that he was part of a network of guardians, each protecting different aspects of royal privacy and historical truth. This revelation came with both relief and additional responsibility. Thomas no longer bore the entire burden of protecting Queen Elizabeth's legacy, but he was also now responsible for maintaining communication with other guardians and ensuring coordinated protection of the broader royal archive system. Queen Elizabeth's letter included contact information for two other guardians, both individuals whose families had served the royal household for generations. Thomas reached out to them carefully, following protocols the Queen had established for secure communication between guardians. The conversations that followed provided Thomas with a broader understanding of the scope and significance of Queen Elizabeth's private archive system. The other guardians were Dr. Margaret Whitmore, a former royal librarian whose archive focused on constitutional and diplomatic materials, and James Hartwell, a retired palace security official who maintained records related to family protection and personal security matters. Together, the three guardians protected a comprehensive record of Queen Elizabeth's private thoughts and experiences across the entire span of her reign. Thomas learned that the system of private archives had been established gradually over decades as Queen Elizabeth identified trustworthy individuals who could be entrusted with different aspects of sensitive royal information. The system reflected her understanding that traditional institutional protections were insufficient for safeguarding royal privacy in an era of increasing media scrutiny and political complexity. The coordination between guardians allowed for more sophisticated analysis of the archive materials and more informed decisions about their appropriate use. Dr. Whitmore's expertise in constitutional history complemented Thomas's practical understanding of security matters, while James Hartwell's knowledge of family protection issues provided context for understanding the personal aspects of royal concerns. Working together, the three guardians developed a comprehensive strategy for managing Queen Elizabeth's legacy while adapting to changing political circumstances. They established regular communication protocols, shared research responsibilities, and created mechanisms for coordinated decision-making about sensitive revelations. Thomas's role evolved from solitary guardian to coordinator of a complex preservation and protection system. His cottage remained the physical home of his portion of the archive, but it also became a communication hub for the broader network of guardians. The responsibility was enormous, but the shared burden made it more manageable and more effective. The Guardian's first major collaborative project involved analyzing Queen Elizabeth's private thoughts on constitutional reform proposals that had gained political momentum in recent years. The Queen's archives contained extensive materials documenting her views on various reform proposals, including insights that could inform contemporary debates while respecting the traditional boundaries of royal political neutrality. Through careful coordination, the Guardians developed a strategy for selectively sharing relevant historical insights with constitutional scholars and political analysts, always ensuring that such information served educational purposes rather than partisan political advantage. The approach honored Queen Elizabeth's apparent intention that her private wisdom should inform future decisions while protecting the monarchy's constitutional position. Thomas found that his work as a guardian increasingly required skills he had never expected to develop. He became proficient in historical research, constitutional analysis, and political assessment. More importantly, he developed the kind of judgment that allowed him to balance competing interests and navigate complex ethical considerations. The role also required Thomas to maintain his official duties as a royal guard while secretly managing one of the most sensitive collections of historical documents in existence. This dual existence was challenging, but also provided valuable cover for his guardian activities. His continued service at Windsor Castle gave him access to current royal family perspectives that informed his understanding of how archive materials might affect contemporary royal interests. As the second anniversary of his discovery approached, Thomas reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. What had begun as routine curiosity about castle architecture had evolved into a role that connected him directly to the deepest traditions of royal service while requiring him to make decisions that could affect British history and constitutional understanding. Thomas had also begun planning for his own eventual succession as guardian. Queen Elizabeth's instructions emphasized the importance of ensuring continuity in the protection of her archive, and Thomas understood that he needed to identify and prepare a future guardian who could maintain the same level of loyalty and discretion. The search for a successor required Thomas to carefully observe his colleagues and assess their character, discretion, and family background. He was looking for someone whose service to the crown was motivated by the same deep loyalty that had sustained his own family's generations of royal service. Thomas identified several potential candidates among the younger guards, individuals whose backgrounds and temperament suggested they might be capable of accepting the responsibilities of guardianship. However, he understood that the final selection would require careful evaluation over time, as Queen Elizabeth had apparently evaluated him before placing the archive where he would discover it. The process of preparing for succession also led Thomas to develop more comprehensive documentation of his work as guardian. He created detailed records of his decisions, methodologies, and relationships with other guardians, ensuring that future guardians would have the guidance necessary to continue the work effectively. Thomas's documentation included not only practical instructions, but also philosophical reflections on the nature of royal service and the balance between institutional loyalty and individual judgment. He wrote about his understanding that guardianship required servants to sometimes act independently while always serving the crown's highest interests. As Thomas continued his work, he increasingly understood that he had become part of a tradition that extended far beyond Queen Elizabeth's reign. The system of private archives and trusted guardians reflected principles of royal service that had sustained the monarchy through centuries of political and social change. The role had transformed Thomas from a loyal servant following orders into an active participant in protecting and preserving royal legacy for future generations. He had become a bridge between Queen Elizabeth's wisdom and the ongoing needs of the monarchy, tasked with applying historical insights to contemporary challenges. Thomas understood that his work would continue for decades, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining the core principles that Queen Elizabeth had established for the protection of royal privacy and the preservation of historical truth. Each decision he made would reflect not only his own judgment but also his understanding of the Queen's intentions and the crown's enduring interests. The cottage that housed Queen Elizabeth's archive had become more than a repository of secrets. It was a center of ongoing royal service that operated outside official channels, but remained deeply connected to the monarchy's essential purposes. Thomas had created a living legacy that honored Queen Elizabeth's vision while adapting to the needs of future generations. As guardian, Thomas had found a form of royal service that was both ancient and modern, rooted in traditional loyalty but responsive to contemporary challenges. He had proven himself worthy of Queen Elizabeth's trust and had established systems that would ensure the continued protection of her legacy long into the future. The discovery that had begun with simple curiosity about castle architecture had evolved into a comprehensive system for protecting and preserving royal wisdom. Thomas Mitchell had become not just a keeper of secrets, but a guardian of the deepest traditions of service to the crown, ensuring that Queen Elizabeth's private insights would continue serving royal interests for generations to come. The hidden chamber in Windsor Castle remained sealed, but the treasures it had contained lived on in the careful stewardship of those who understood that some forms of royal service transcend official duties and require the kind of personal loyalty that sustains monarchy across centuries of change. Thomas had accepted that trust and had proven himself worthy of the confidence that Queen Elizabeth had placed in the loyalty of those who serve the crown with absolute devotion.